during this pandemic and economic crisis. And, unfortunately, the reports of even more cases, a real spike in El Paso County in the last couple of days shows us, that we're far from done with this. And we've all got to do our part to make sure that we're being as safe and as healthy as we can be for ourselves and for our families, but for all of us, right? For all of our communities, so we can safely get back to work and our kids can safely get back into the classroom. My story really starts over 40 years ago when my mom came to this country. My mom graduated from the #1 university in the Philippines, but she wanted a chance at the American dream. Like so many, she learned from a very young age that in order to live her best possible life, she'd probably have to leave her home country. And, I carry that with me because the same fire in the belly that brought my mom to this country is the same fire in the belly that is bringing people to our border. And unfortunately, they're being met with inhumanity and with cruelty. And, it's really that my mom's example and her story that she instilled in my sister and I every single day, that we're just very lucky, not smart, lucky to be born in this very special country. We have to give back to a country that gave us so much. It's why I served. It's why my sister serves in the Navy to this day. And, it wasn't always easy. My mom raised my younger sister and me by herself. And so I think there's a special place in heaven for single mothers. That place is probably open bar, as it should be. Reduced lunch, subsidized housing, those were critical investments, not handouts. Investments allowed me to earn a 4-year Air Force ROTC scholarship that allowed me to get an education and then go on to serve our country, working almost 15 years to protect our economic and our national security. I served as an intelligence officer in the Air Force, deployed to Iraq. And, one of the things that has really shaped one of my main priorities is my family's own story with healthcare. After my deployment to Iraq, I came home to surprise mom, and she surprised me. She said that while I was deployed, she'd been diagnosed with colon cancer, had the surgery to have it removed, and was already undergoing chemotherapy. And I'll never forget the fear that I felt when I stood there in her kitchen, the fear that I could lose my mom, but also the fear that her treatment could bankrupt us. And so thankfully, she had good insurance through her job as a public school teacher. And I want to make sure all working families have that same chance, right? And as it's as I'm talking to the chamber, right? I mean, the chamber understands the importance of families having, that economic security, right? That peace of mind, which really contributes to our community's strength. I advised on operations all over Latin America, all over Africa, and then I wrapped up my federal career working in the Executive Office of the President on economic and national security issues. It's a portfolio that looked at foreign investment coming into the country and reviewed those transactions to make sure they didn't pose any threats to our national security. So I've been very honored to serve our country in a number of ways. I've lived the American dream. I've been also fortunate to see the importance, really the indispensability of American leadership. And that's why I just know it's so important that we get our country back on the right track. And it's so important that we help working families get through this very difficult time.
So you started off by mentioning the pandemic. Sorry, tell us, how has it been campaigning during a global pandemic, and how has that changed your campaign?
Well, before the pandemic, healthcare was the #1 issue in this district, right? From San Antonio to Socorro, and all along the border, access to quality, affordable healthcare was by far the #1 issue. My apologies. My apologies. Was by far the #1 issue that voters would raise with me. And now with this pandemic, we have seen, unfortunately, the consequences of a lack of investment, certainly in border healthcare, rural healthcare, and what that's meant. I mean, all of us have seen the stories of the Lower Valley and the delays that they've had in having adequate testing, making sure that there's enough contact tracers, making sure that our rural healthcare facilities and hospitals have the adequate PPE, so our frontline workers, have their resources. So I think, this time has only highlighted the importance of quality, affordable healthcare. And, before the pandemic, I was all over this district. I've been to Clint several times, have eaten at Mamacita several times. I was honored to spend some time even with the Tiguas at their Feast of St. Anthony, a beautiful celebration. And, at this time though, and I'm sure probably my background in national security is you listen to experts, you listen to medical experts. And, they have been saying we need additional testing. We also need to take steps, though, that minimize the risk to ourselves, our families, and to our communities. And so I look forward to making sure that our community is well represented. We have the healthcare that we need, and making sure also that we have an inclusive economic recovery. Right? I mean, it's so important that we get this pandemic under control, because as we're seeing in places like El Paso, that has real economic consequences. Right? I mean, the lost revenue as the bridges are closed. Right? We've got to make sure that we get this pandemic under control as quickly as possible. So again, we can get folks back to work, and we can get kids back into the classroom as safely as possible.
Well, you spoke about the vastness of your district. It's probably one of the largest districts in Texas, and how you've been all over the place. But as one of the largest in the country, and it covers a very small portion of El Paso, how will you prioritize and address the concerns of the small business in this area?
Sure. This is a large district. It's larger than 30 states, and it's got 29 counties. But look, all 29 counties are as important as any other. And I think it's really important that we prioritize, the parts of the district that have for too long been neglected. For too long have not had sufficient representation and advocacy when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to infrastructure. I mean, Socorro is one of the fastest growing parts of this district. Right. And so we've got to invest in the infrastructure, that broadband, for example, so that in communities where there aren't doctors, there is at least telehealth or telepsychiatry. We also have to invest in good paying jobs, right, to make sure that we are closing the gap between our urban and rural communities. And so I think, representing the Lower Valley and making sure that they're prioritized, if you want to lead, you will lead. Right. If you want to fight for your community, you will figure out a way to do so. And that's what always I've been motivated by in my life of my career of public service. It's never been about politics. It's always been about what have we been asked to do in the interest of the country? How do we build a team to get it done? And how do we hold ourselves accountable if we fall short of that? And with so many working families suffering right now, I think that's exactly the lens that we need to be focused on and using during this time.
Yeah, well, you touched on how the pandemic has devastated people across the country, specifically small business. What kind of legislation do you think would be adequate to help these small businesses?
Yeah, well, I think it's been clear that we've lost over 100,000 small businesses in our country, and we know when you look at the small businesses that applied for the PPP loans, whether it's because they didn't have the exact relationship with a certain kind of bank or what have you, but we know minority-owned small businesses disproportionately did not receive the assistance that they applied for through the PPP program. And so again, we've got to focus on making sure that communities and small businesses, especially in our rural and in our border communities, are not left behind. And so, focusing on that, there is we can talk about the amount, but I think it's as important that we are focused on targeting that assistance to those that can best use it. I also want to make sure that we are looking at the ways in which certain communities have been disproportionately affected by this pandemic, in particular women. Right. In particular, women. Just in September, we had 865,000 women in our country leave the workforce, and that's for a number of reasons. Right. They're disproportionately the childcare issues fall to the working mom, on top of maybe other care issues in the family. Access to affordable quality childcare is I know still a challenge in places that are struggling with a pandemic, on top of maybe not having flexible work accommodations. And so if we have so many women permanently leaving the workforce or not re-entering the workforce for an extended period of time, what that does is delay our economic recovery. So I think we need to be investing in affordable childcare and understanding that to be as critical a part of our infrastructure as anything, right? I mean, look, if we're going to save the airline industry, we got to save the childcare industry so that all working parents can safely get back to work, and we can get our economy open again and robust again as quickly as possible.
So you mentioned you mentioned how the rural areas, the businesses there, they're not able to apply for those PPP loans for all that help. And we actually just had a survey that we sent out, and the results showed us that a lot of people don't qualify. They're not qualifying for those loans, for those grants, for any kind of program. And so that's definitely a priority here at the Chamber. With that, I wanted to ask.
I will say one thing. One of the things that a key group here in San Antonio, and I know they also have a presence in El Paso, has been Lift Fund. Right, these entities that know their communities very well. I think one of the lessons learned from this experience is, we've got to work with those entities on the ground that know their communities, know where the gaps are, so we can quickly make sure the assistance gets to where it needs to get. So when we're talking about PPP loans, Lift Fund, if we're talking about workforce development, also identifying those folks on the ground that are best positioned and understand truly the wraparound services that are needed so that these programs are as efficient and as effective as possible.
Yes, and here at the chamber, we actually just ended one of our grant. We were giving out a grant that we received in order to help these rural businesses, and we would go out and ask them to apply for free money, and we're also giving free PPE to businesses to keep our community safe, to try and lower those COVID cases here in El Paso. So we're working really hard on that. I wanted to ask you about how do you feel about the border restrictions that's placed on us? As you mentioned, that is a huge revenue for the city of El Paso and for most of your district that is on the border. So what do you think needs to be done? How do you feel about these restrictions?
Well, this is a district that has 800 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border, and so those social, cultural, economic ties are sources of strength. And as we look to safely reopen up our economies, obviously getting this pandemic under control, is really the first task to make sure that we don't have to close the bridges again, right? That the priority should be protecting people's lives, protecting people's livelihoods, and doing this in a way that looks at the data, listens to medical experts, so we can quickly open up the bridges again. Because I completely understand just how critical that cross-border activity is. But we have to get this pandemic under control. We still need additional resources for testing, for contact tracing, and so forth, so that we can really blunt this pandemic and get on with living our lives as normally as possible.
Well, as our business
Let me say one more thing on that, though, because I think it's a really important piece. Is that I think it's important, one, we get the pandemic under control so we can safely open up our economy. It's clear, though, right, that based on the experience with this pandemic and the economic crisis, that we have to be investing in advanced skills training. We have to be investing in the infrastructure that makes sure that communities like the Lower Valley aren't so vulnerable in the future. So for me, that means investing in our community health clinics. That means protecting and expanding the ACA and including a public option that covers people in our state that should have access to Medicaid if our governor had the courage to expand Medicaid under the ACA. Right before the pandemic, that was 1.5 million people. We know that number is significantly higher now as people have lost their jobs and they've lost their health insurance. But that was 30% of the non-elderly uninsured in our state. And so we know what a dramatic impact that would have in communities like the Lower Valley, ensuring that, one, they can pay for their care, two, they can get regular preventive care, and three, then have the infrastructure like broadband that not only helps to strengthen small businesses, but also helps to strengthen and ensure families have the resources for telehealth, for telepsychiatry, right? So their kid can get online and get their classes and do their classes as needed. So, when we think about getting this pandemic under control, at the same time, we have to be making the investments that set our communities up for economic strength moving forward. That's how we should be spending the money. To be very clear, my opponent wants to spend $15 billion on a border wall. I do not agree with that, especially since this border wall, he said he wants to finish the border wall. I don't think we need a border wall. I think it's wasteful and ineffective. We should be investing in the infrastructure, things like I just identified. And let's also never forget this border wall that my opponent wants to finish defunds Fort Bliss, right? So let's be very clear about that. The consequences of this wasteful and ineffective border wall at the cost of bases like Fort Bliss, but also at the cost of things that we should be investing in, that we know that our communities actually need to be economically strong.
I'm so glad you mentioned about the online presence. I think it's very important for our businesses to adapt to the new normal. You know, we're not going back to the old normal anytime soon. So I think it's so important for the businesses across the nation to get on that online presence and just, you know, adjust to the new normal.
Absolutely. And well, when we talk about this new normal, right? I mean, what we're increasingly finding is that companies are rethinking, they're reimagining what work is going to look like. And, now maybe the company is based in New York or in Los Angeles or San Francisco, and they're going to tell their employees, hey, you know what? You don't have to work here. You can work from wherever you want. And that's great. And we want those folks, though, to consider working from home from El Paso, from the Lower Valley. Those folks, though, are used to having broadband, right? They're used to having access to healthcare, at least access to telehealth or telepsychiatry, telemedicine. And so my concern is that if we're not being proactive and making these investments in this basic level of infrastructure that people are used to, then they're not going to consider places like St. Elie or Fabens or Clint when thinking about places they can work from home, even though they'd like to. They know that lack of broadband or that lack of healthcare is going to be a challenge for them and their family. So that's why we have to make these investments so all of our communities, to include the Lower Valley, are as economically competitive as possible.
Well, Gina, you mentioned a little bit about immigration. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your immigration stands and what would you support? What kind of legislation would you support if elected?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a proud first generation American, right? And I showed you, I explained kind of how my mom's example and my family's story has just shaped my understanding of why we need leaders who understand that immigration is an opportunity. It's a responsibility to reflect our values and our immigration policies, but also such an opportunity, economic opportunity for sure. And so I support a Clean Dream Act. These DACA recipients, these dreamers, are American in every sense of the word. We need to keep the promise that we made to these young people. A couple of months ago, I had the chance to speak with Josue. Josue is an ICU nurse there in El Paso County. And this was right before the Supreme Court decision. And he shared with me, the stress that he felt of being an ICU nurse working during COVID-19, but also the stress that he felt of any day now the Supreme Court could relay their decision that would change his life forever, right, and that of his family's life. And so, I want our frontline workers, I want, frankly, anybody there are teachers that are in our military, they're in our communities. I want them to be able to fully contribute to a country that has given them so much. So for me, we've got to make sure that we keep the promise to those folks. And ensure that we're living up to our values. We were not a country that breaks promises. And let's never forget, the real economic impact it has on our state. Between California and Texas, that's almost half of the country's dreamers, right? So it matters. These policies matter more in Texas, just given what a high percentage of the dreamers actually live in our state. And so from an economic standpoint, from a moral imperative, I think we keep the promise that we made to those young folks and put them on a path to citizenship. My opponent, again, supports this border wall. And when I talk to leaders on the border, this is not what they want. They want additional infrastructure like bridges, that taps into the economic, social, cultural ties between these two communities that are sources of strength. And it makes sense, right? I mean, the more cross-border activity, the more money that our communities have for streets and schools and hospitals, right? We should be investing in the infrastructure that leverages those ties, not building this wasteful, ineffective border wall that steals from our military bases to get it done.
Gina, you've spoken about infrastructure and immigration. I know you really care about healthcare, but why don't you tell us about your three priorities if elected?
Yeah, actually, we've chatted about them, but I'm happy to hit them again. The first one is quality, affordable healthcare, and this healthcare affects everybody's every single day, right? You got to be healthy enough to show up to work. Kids got to be healthy enough to show up into the classroom. And, frankly, I mean, the business community also understands that if people have less money in their pocket because they're paying more for their medical expenses, that means that's less money for them to go out and spend money in our communities. So that directly impacts our community's overall economic strength. So I want to protect and expand the ACA, lower the cost of prescription drugs, expand access to healthcare. My opponent wants to do the opposite. He wants to eliminate the ACA and its protections for people with pre-existing conditions. So what does that mean? That means he wants to take us back to a time when insurance companies could deny somebody coverage or jack up their premiums only because they had a pre-existing condition. So surviving cancer like my mom, diabetes, hypertension, asthma, COVID-19 survivors, right? I mean, to go back to that time, I think would be disastrous for our economy and for so many folks in our community. Over 800,000 Texans have had COVID-19. And if they didn't have a pre-existing condition before this, they absolutely have one now. And so we have to protect working families. It starts with quality, affordable healthcare. And that means we protect people with pre-existing conditions. And it's inexcusable that my opponent wants to take away somebody's healthcare during a pandemic. So priority one, quality, affordable healthcare. Two, good paying jobs, but also investing in the advanced skills training. So many people have lost their jobs, unfortunately, and they've lost their jobs permanently. And so we need to be investing in workforce development that trains that person for, another higher paying job, to include, investing in the wraparound services. I know that somebody's ability to participate in a workforce development program, requires that they have help with transportation, that they have help with childcare. And so we have to tailor these programs so that working families, especially, in this district, which is 70% Hispanic, that disproportionately folks from a certain socioeconomic demographic don't get left behind. And let me just make one other point real quick on the healthcare point. I forgot to mention, when we don't get this pandemic under control and when folks don't have access to quality, affordable healthcare, we know it disproportionately impacts the Hispanic community. I mean, if a young kid gets COVID-19, if a young Hispanic kid gets COVID-19, they are 8 times more likely to need to go to the hospital than a white child. If you're a Black child, 5 times more likely. And we know the rates of uninsured within our Hispanic community are also higher. So this is a recipe for disaster if we don't get this pandemic under control and if we don't ensure working families have access to quality, affordable healthcare. So healthcare, talked about jobs and workforce development, and then certainly infrastructure. The fact that there are some places in the lower valley that still have arsenic in their water, that is inexcusable. That is inexcusable. In the richest country in the world, in a state with a $1.8 trillion economy, you are not going to tell me that we don't have the resources to make sure that people have clean drinking water in this country. This is about leadership, though, right? We know we've got the resources. Now we need leaders who are going to prioritize these things and make sure that we're not leaving people behind.
Yeah, so thank you so much. That was a lot, but very good answer. Where do you see the country, regardless of what administration it is? Where do you think our country is headed?
Well, I hope we are. I hope we are getting back to a time where we weren't so divided. And I know you said kind of regardless of who wins the election, but I think that answer very much depends on who wins this election, and very much depends on the types of leaders that we elect to be our voice in Congress. And that's why I think it's so important we send people of character, right? Healthcare is on the ballot, equality is on the ballot, but you know what? Character is on the ballot. We know it didn't have to be this bad. If our leaders listened to experts and then took the steps to prepare us for this pandemic and economic crisis, and then we're truthful with with the American people so that people could, again, make decisions to protect themselves and their families and then thus our communities. And so we have to have leaders, yes, that are going to focus on, shoring up small businesses, making the investments in infrastructure. But at the end of the day, we also need leaders that are going to be truthful and honest with us and make sure that we are doing right to save people's lives and save people's livelihoods. I worked in national security again for almost 15 years. I'm a proud public servant. And it's always been about what have we been asked to do in the interest of the country? How do we build a team to get it done? How do we hold ourselves accountable, right? These are very basic things. It's a public servant's mindset, a public servant's skill set I look forward to bringing in service to this district.
And well, you spoke a little bit about just how polarized everything is. How would you work with the Republican Party to get legislation passed? As we see right now in the Senate, nothing is getting passed just because it's Republicans versus Democrats. How do you think that should be handled?
Well, I think when you look at it, though, there's actually been a lot of good legislation that has passed the House, right? Whether you talk about COVID-19 relief, whether you talk about voting rights legislation, common sense gun reform, and taking big money out of politics, all these things have passed the House. I don't think you ever stop doing your job just because somebody isn't doing theirs, right? And there's always a way in which we can improve things and at least set ourselves up for success, hopefully the next time when there are people that do want to work on these things. So I look forward to working with anybody. For example, I get my own healthcare through the VA. And I know what a challenge it is. There are certainly some improvements that can be made. I'm thankful for it, but there are some real improvements that can be made there, especially in making sure that we're meeting the needs of our rural veterans. And so, look, if there's somebody on whatever side of the aisle, if you want to work on that, then let's work on that. And I think it's actually in that experience that first and foremost, get something done for the American people, but then also develop trust, right? Develop trust so that you can take that and work on the next thing together. That's always how I have conducted, my public service. And I think it's again, that lens. It has to be about providing results and serving folks. And I think, if you go into it with good intentions and listening to experts, there's quite a bit of good we can still do.
Well, thank you so much. I think those are it for my questions, but we do have some audience questions, so I'll go ahead and get started with those.
Great.
The first one is, what are your thoughts on the current protests and social unrest regarding racial inequality? What can the House do to ease these racial tensions?
Yeah, well, I think it's very clear that, bad cops make it harder for good cops to do their jobs. And we know the vast majority of cops show up every single day and do exactly what they're entrusted to do, which is protect people and do so in a way that is respectful of communities. I think it's also clear, though, that, experiences like Breonna Taylor, like George Floyd show us that, we need some real reforms because not everybody has the same experience in our criminal justice system, especially Black men. And so this is what I support. I think, though, that anything that we do moving forward has to be done with law enforcement. Again, I worked in national security for almost 15 years. I know how important it is that we work with law enforcement to make sure these reforms are as effective as possible. So I support additional investments in mental health training for our police officers so they can, adequately and appropriately respond to those situations. Additional investments in anti-recidivism. So there's not just a revolving door for folks. Also making sure that we're doing better data collection as well on the use of force. At the federal level, I think it's also important that we have a federal standard on the use of force, as well as have some type of registry that captures the names of folks that have engaged in misconduct and have a long record of doing so. So that that person can't just move 30 miles down the road and engage in misconduct in that community. I think these are all steps that are critical, again, with law enforcement. They're critical steps to enhancing the transparency and accountability in our communities so that our communities are as safe as possible.
And then the other one that we have, or another one that we have, what are your thoughts on our military budget?
Sure. As somebody that worked in national security for almost 15 years and on the intelligence side as an analyst, I think it's always important, that we're looking at how we are spending our money, right? What are we trying to accomplish? And then based on what we are doing now, how does that accomplish that? I think it's always important to revisit your assumptions, especially in an environment that is changing as quickly as our world, right? As quickly as our world. And so, I think it's clear that we need to be investing in things to like a public health infrastructure, so that we have the resources in the future to quickly identify and then respond to a future pandemic. We know this is not going to be the last pandemic, so we've got to prepare now for what does that mean. But I also think those are frankly good paying jobs, and those are the types of investments that we as a country need to be making in the interest of our international and our economic security. And so I think it's always healthy to ask the questions, what are we trying to accomplish? How well are we doing that now? Also, always guided by, when are we putting our men and women in harm's way? And is it absolutely necessary, right? We should not be afraid to ask those questions. I certainly will not be, as a veteran myself, a proud Iraq War veteran, and also, frankly, as the sister of somebody, of an active duty member. We have to be, for our men and women that are so courageous to raise their right hand and say, I will support and defend the Constitution. We owe it to them to ask the tough questions, and then making sure that they are as well resourced as they can be. So we are, living up to our values as a country.
Then you just touched on what the pandemic will look like, 6 months from now, a year from now. What, if elected, what kind of coronavirus relief package would you pass or would you support?
Sure. Well, I think, it's hard to say what would be needed in 6 months. I think we know we have a pretty good idea of what's needed right now, though, right? Working families only received $1,200 several months ago. And we need to get working families help right now. We need to help small businesses that have recently gone out of business or on the brink of going out of business, so that they can keep folks on their payroll. And then we need to help, and we still need a national testing strategy so that communities have the resources to not only get this pandemic under control, but then have the resources moving forward to quickly identify it, right? Nobody wants to shut down. The best way to avoid that is to make sure that our communities have the testing resources so they can quickly identify it, isolate it, and then move on. And that has to be the priority now, so that we can, again, safely open up the economy, safely get people back to work. People feel safe spending money in our restaurants, at our small businesses. All of that requires getting this pandemic under control. So that has to be the priority, on top of helping people, with their rent, getting working families and small businesses more help as soon as possible.
And a final we have two more questions. Somebody asks, what different plans do you have for El Paso, and how can we trust you that you advocate for our city? Trust that you'll advocate for our city.
Sure. Well, we talked about some of those things a little bit earlier with, my focus on quality, affordable healthcare, especially in our rural communities, like many in the Lower Valley, that for too long have been neglected. And making sure that we're investing in the infrastructure like broadband, and in our community health clinics and so forth, so that these needs are being met. On top of, making sure that we're training our folks with advanced skills training and so forth, to make sure that they're as competitive as possible. So healthcare, infrastructure, and jobs, that's the focus. And we also, I think, have to be proactive and have a vision for where we want to go. And one of those things is leveraging the natural advantages that we have in Texas, but also in this part of the state, which is clean energy, right? Clean energy jobs. Texas produces 25% of the country's wind energy. We're the 5th largest producer of solar in the entire country. These are good paying jobs, and they're the types of jobs that are critical to helping close the gap between our urban and rural communities. The Lower Valley also has a very vibrant, ag community. And so making sure that we're supporting our farmers and our ranchers, making sure that they are as competitive as possible. Obviously I'm talking to a business community here, so, we know tariffs don't work. right? We know those make it very hard for our producers, for our manufacturers to sell our goods. And so again, we have to think about the competitiveness and the viability of our communities. And that starts with smart policies and investing in people.
I'm so glad that you touched on the energy sector here in Texas. What are your thoughts on climate change and the pollution caused by the oil and gas industry?
So, the climate change is real, right? We can't have people that don't think it's real. And I see climate change in a number of ways. One, it's a national security issue. When you have senior military leaders that are talking about climate change in the context of national security, what they're saying is, we have trained our mission and resourced our men and women in uniform to do mission X, Y, and Z. However, they are increasingly having to respond to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts. So there's a risk there between what we've asked and trained them to do and resourced them to do, and then what they're having to do. There's also a real public health point aspect to this, which we cannot ignore. And the fact that, look, 1 in 11 kids in Texas has asthma. In Bexar County, where I grew up, it's 1 in 7. And excuse me, I don't have the El Paso stats off the top of my head, but in the working class community like I grew up in, it's like 2 or 3 out of 7. Right. So to have such high rates of something like asthma on top of having so many uninsured kids and so many families that don't have adequate health insurance, that's a recipe for disaster long term. And we know these rates are higher in the Hispanic community. And so, we have to understand the consequences of climate change on public health. And then lastly, as I just mentioned, though, it's a clear economic opportunity, right? We have to invest in these things. We've got to double down on the infrastructure that we have now. We've got to invest in advanced skills training so that we're ready for, investing in the technology as well, carbon capture, investing in battery storage, right? These are the next things that everyone is trying to crack the nut on. But we can absolutely, we can stand to benefit quite a bit if we can do as much of that in this congressional district. So we've got to stay ahead. And let's also never forget, the international aspect of this. El Paso is a very international community. And, when we look at climate change and in clean energy writ large, China is responsible for over half of the world's investment in clean energy right now. So I think climate energy, we also have to understand in the aspect of, competing and leading versus getting left behind. And we've got the infrastructure, we've got the talent. I think we double down on those things so that we can truly benefit and address climate change in the way that it needs to be.
Well, thank you so much, Gina. I guess I just wanted to finish by asking you, you would be the first woman, the first Filipino American, and you would also be the first openly gay person to represent this district. What does that mean to you? And what does it mean for your district?
Well, I would be honored to be the first of all of those things, but it's more important I'm not the last. It's most important that this congressional district is well served. And, my lived experiences have shown me why it's important that you're constantly asking the question, who does this affect? Who is getting left behind? What are the unintended consequences of this? And who am I not hearing from? That's always a really important question, is who is not at the table? Who should be at the table? Who should we be hearing from? And I think when we look at, the Lower Valley's experience during this pandemic, it's clear there has not been, unfortunately, sufficient attention and focus on making sure that communities in the Lower Valley are best postured and ready for this from an economic standpoint, but also from a public health standpoint. So I look forward to being a good representative for all 29 counties in this district, and I'd be honored to have your vote.
Well, with that, I would like to give you some time to just give any closing remarks that you would like to say to our members.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And, I've really appreciated this. And I always appreciate, the contributions of an entity like the Chamber of Commerce, because and especially the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, in the countries that I've served in, it was always very clear that one of the reasons that they were unstable and insecure was because there were always a few at the top that had a lot of the resources. And there were a lot of folks at the bottom kind of fighting for scraps. And because they didn't have a strong middle class, right? That is what led to societies and economies breaking down. And so when I think of the Chamber of Commerce, I think of the critical role that you provide in helping small businesses, as well, again, especially the Hispanic Chamber, entrepreneurs, Hispanic entrepreneurs starting their business, and then frankly, also then employing others in their community. We know over half of the folks in our country are employed by a small business owner. So I want to thank you for the work that you do to help, strengthen our communities economically, help get as many small businesses off the ground as possible. And I look forward to being a good partner with you to make sure our economic recovery is as inclusive as possible.
Well, thank you so much. We wish you the best of luck on the rest of your campaign coming to an end real soon. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today for our election chats, Get the Facts with Ms. Gina Ortiz-Jones. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.